Wow, this is a bright light. Hi, good afternoon. This is the final presentation of the day. So I guess I'm the one who stands between you and happy hour right now. But I'm going to try to be quick and smooth through this. And what I'm going to talk to you about is the Neo4j Innovation Lab. And my name is Alessandro Svensson, and I am the head of the Neo4j Innovation Lab, which is a global team at Neo4j. In case you're wondering about my name, I am half Italian and half Swedish. And this is actually the environment that I grew up in. But now I live in San Francisco, actually across the street from Market here in the Mission. And I work out of our San Mateo office just 30 minutes south of here. Yeah, so I run our innovation lab, which is something that we introduced in 2017. And that was the year when we had our first pilot project with a healthcare company out of Europe. And what we do in the innovation lab is that we run these sort of applied innovation workshops together with our customers with the purpose of accelerating innovation and transformation through graph thinking. So it's much more focused on the value proposition of graphs as opposed to sort of like the technical details. The way we do this is that we generate and prototype graph projects together with our customers and prospects. And our methodology is the standard format is a 3.5-day workshop, typically on site, and we call this the Innovation Lab Sprint. And what really the Innovation Lab is, it's basically a team from Neo4j that works together with an innovation team from a customer. And the configuration of a lab team at Neo is that we bring 3 different perspectives here. So one role is the lab leader, which is essentially kind of like the head facilitator. And the background of our lab leaders is more kind of like from the strategy side and the design thinking side. Obviously, a Neo4j field engineer who covers everything that has to do with engineering, data science, cipher, algorithms, and all of that kind of stuff that we've been talking about today. And we also have UX designers or process designers as part of this mix. And from the customer side, it's typically between 3 and 8 participants. So it's a classic kind of like sprint group, and we don't want to keep it larger than this just for workability reasons. And these teams are ideally cross-functional, that they are sort of put together from different parts of the organization. And that can be IT, operations, sales, the business side, innovation people, strategy people, and so on. And typically, the sort of the standard configuration of these teams is that most Fortune 2000 companies have these sort of teams, innovation teams that are sort of placed outside of the complexities of an organization with the job really to be curious about new way of doing things, right? And they call them lighthouses or innovation teams or transformation teams and so on. So I think this is sort of like our target audience, and then all of this looks a little bit different depending on your company. And the expected outcome of these labs is not to build anything really like in detail and as you would approach like a classic sort of POC. Is really to provide a deep understanding of thinking in graphs and also open up and validate for sort of like the possibilities and innovation that these teams will see open up by adopting Neo4j and graphs. And we've done so many of these by now. So as part of just providing at least a deep understanding of the possibilities with graphs at a company, I feel validated enough to say that this is actually a guarantee. This will happen like after spending these 3.5 days with us. So I'm going to talk to you today about our methodology and go through that pretty much in detail. But before we do that, I just want to set some context how we think about business value in this paradigm of connected data. I'm sure all of you have seen this, this chart and this chart at some point, but for those of you who haven't, the left one is the Standard & Poor's 500 average company lifespan. And what we've seen is that large companies tend to have a shorter lifespan now than they did, you know, in the 60s, 80s, and the 2000s and so on. The fact is that a Fortune 500 company or S&P 500 company today is expected to live only 15 years. So the era of these sort of 100-year-old companies is definitely coming to an end, right? And interestingly, what we see is that these last 15 years is also the 15 years where the exponential growth of data has happened. So there's a huge sort of correlation between the growth of data and the disruption that happens, especially in the big enterprise. So what we can see here is that there's a competitive game that has a completely new logic, right? So first of all, data is, of course, the raw material on which you build products and services, and that's nothing strange nowadays. But also these learning algorithms and network effects have created this dynamic, almost like these sort of winner-takes-it-all dynamics, which makes it very, very hard to play catch-up, right? And the capture of data and the leverage of data connection is also very much at the core of this. And the best case study to understand this is actually just like look at any sort of consumer web company out there today. And regardless of industry, it can be search, it could be banking, industry, whatever you can think of, you will see sort of this paradigm shift in going from something static to something connected. And that's what this company on the right figured out, that the way to leverage the data is actually through data connections. So what we're looking at here is really a paradigm shift in mindset. It's not just a technology thing, because it's a different execution when you think about connected data, apart from, of course, being a technology shift. And I would say 100% of every customer that the Innovation Lab team walks into are sort of stuck in this paradigm, that their silos will look like this, their data will look like this, and as a consequence, their organization will also have this shape. Like you would have different departments that don't talk to each other and all of that stuff. And all of that, it's kind of like in a dance with each other, right? So what we're looking at, it's what would open up if you were able to make this shift into graph as a way of thinking, right? And if we look today how organizations innovate using Neo4j, so there are three dominating paths here, right? And I think throughout this day we have definitely covered these two, the developer path and the line of business path. And the developer path is sort of our origin, being an open source company, where a developer would understand that they have a connected problem and then go to look for, okay, what is a good technology to solve these particular workloads, etc. And that's how they find us through our community and so on. And they download our community edition and they start sort of experimenting. And that has been basically the story of Neo4j up till just a couple of years ago. And then we have also talked today about a lot of these use cases that have sort of grown organically in the graph space, that graphs just seems to be a proven fit for, you know, fraud detection, recommendation engine, personalizations, and network management, and all of those types of things. So if you're a line of business manager, there's a lot of benchmark around these use cases, which sort of points you in the direction of graphs. But then we have this third innovation path, which is basically all of the enterprises that understand intuitively that connected data is going to be part of their strategic future, but they're not into this enough to actually know what their use cases are or where to begin, or they just get immediately that our business is connected. We experience a lot of pain not leveraging that, and where should we start? So if we look at the sort of the typical graph use cases that we approach, it's almost like a box ticking exercise, right? Because they're so there's so much benchmarks. So if we go in and work with you around fraud detection, we will have like reference architectures, we will have best practices, we will have a ton of case studies, and we would actually have done this with many large banks already. So this is a pretty straightforward use case, even though it can be complicated from a corporate culture perspective to make these transitions. But there's a clear path sort of how to get there. The use case that we look at within the lab, it's digital transformation, which is not a box-ticking exercise at all, right? It's actually a set of very, very, very hard problems that are not necessarily technical. So it can be a organization culture problem. It can be a problem of attracting like the right talent. It can be a problem from a business perspective, an engineering perspective, or a user experience and design perspective. But what we see is that all of these, even non-technical problem, has this sort of connected data narrative. And lastly, to make that point, like innovation in organization is extremely complex, right? Besides of or apart from the technical perspective. Like so, this sort of first layer here, which is like the potential raw data that you can capture, that's actually pretty intuitive because if you're a retailer, for example, you know your business domain, right? But then during the past 30 years, we have sort of taken all this data and stored it in different silos. So it's more like the technology has actually made the business, an interpretation of the business that is actually more complex than the business itself, or at least less intuitive. And then we have mitigated this with like data warehouses and data lakes and all of that kind of stuff to have everything in one place. But it still doesn't solve the sort of complexity issues. And then we have these cool new things like graphs that helps mitigate this somewhat. And I like what Michael Moore was saying this morning, is that if you're an executive and if you're sort of I think there's a point here. Yeah, if you're like in this realm, which is more where strategy and business decision happens, you don't care about this stuff. Like you don't want to hear about SQL or Cypher or anything for that matter, right? Because you just want it to work, and you just want sort of the business to run in a way that is intuitive. So the thing is, the cool thing with graphs from an innovation point of view is that this actually makes sense, right? With the graph, we don't have to. It's naturally a representation that sort of fosters complexity. So if the domain is complex, that's actually a good thing for the graph because it's just a more natural way of presenting something. So if you have a connected data workload, it's actually going to be a pretty good match, which is a good thing for sort of explainability around technology. So this is what we leverage in the innovation lab, and this is really what we want to craft. Like, what is the value proposition with a use case? So I'm going to talk to you about how we solve this, like what our methodology looks like, and so on. So first of all, thinking about like what innovation looks like. So it's important to remember that innovation is never an event, right? And there's a lot of us reading about this in the media, and in case studies, we always hear about the successes of things, and it's sort of sloppy represented in a way that we think that these are like genius moments where all of this innovation happens, which is of course not true. Like innovation is very, very tricky, and it's extremely random, and all of these sort of companies and innovation that we admire have had a very crooked path into sort of how they happened. So what you can say for sure is that innovation is more of a process and a very random process. The good news is that it's a process that can actually be designed. And that's exactly what we're looking at within the innovation lab, what that would look like optimized for graph, so graph thinking. So we have 3 focus areas here that we want to cover within our workshops, and that is, first of all, discovery and ideation, which is all about use case generation. Of course, the technology and the data science, which is sort of like our natural habitat, and then the viability of the value proposition with this. So discovery and ideation is all about answering the question of what, right? Like using design thinking to understand the underlying needs for what to innovate. The technology part is more about the how, and here we focus, of course, on the graphs, but also of understanding the technical limitations that you have today and how they affect your products and services, right? So it's almost like an opposite there. And also by defining the requirements and sort of like the architecture that it's required to capture and connect your data. And this is the most important one, which is the viability and the value proposition, right? Like, so there's no point in looking at a use case if it's not significant. Typically you want, in an enterprise, you want the significant to have some sort of business effect. It could be either, you know, costs or new revenue streams or something like that that corresponds to your existing business logic. But it can also be completely new things that opens up for executing on completely new ideas. So when we sort of hit this sweet spot, that's what we call kind of like the innovation lab sweet spot, and that's what we want to foster with this methodology. So this is what our process looks like in a nutshell. What we want to do is, first of all, identify a target use case. That target use case then spawns a bunch of related graph questions, as we call them, which is, when you get into graph modeling, that's sort of like the pathway to generate a model. Everything is based on what you want the data to answer. That's your queries, basically, and that's what sort of renders the model. Based on that, we build a prototype and wireframes, and then we end the sprint with what we call an executive feedback presentation. And this is really key, that we're not building you know, like a POC grade product. It's all about arriving very, very fast to get sort of executive input on something. I've been at Neo4j for about 4 or 5 years, and what we've seen is that companies have really struggled with sort of like their own value proposition and positioning this as something important. So it can be that the use case is spot on. The reason for building is very well validated, but then it enters sort of this enterprise environment where companies can spend 9 to 12 months just validating something. And if you're, you know, like in retail and you haven't figured out like your online business yet, then 12 months is like a lifetime. It's basically life and death, depending on how hard disruption has sort of hit your industry. So if you look at this a little bit more in detail, the way we arrive at these target use cases is that we look at the challenges that they have today, both from a business perspective, but mainly from a technical perspective, the opportunities they see with connecting all of these together, the North Stars, which will be sort of like their strategic roadmap, like where they're heading, and then we list all the key entities that we can find. And that's like stakeholders, systems, silos where the data lives and so on, and we do exercises around how all of that relates. And typically from that exercise, which is a pretty straightforward design thinking exercise, we end up with a backlog of potential use cases that we then sort of pick one and we go through these modeling exercises. So by the end of the first day, we actually end up with a pretty okay model that we then refactor a little bit throughout the week. Then we move into 2 different tracks here, and the first one is the sort of the technical thing where we materialize this model that we have built, and here we go into everything that we've been talking about today, like the visualization part that's required, the graph algorithms, pretty advanced cipher and all of that stuff. But also we spend equally amount of time to make sure to craft a scenario and prototypes where this model actually lives. So we have this dichotomy between the technical, like kind of following the model, but also make sure that this has a representation in some sort of business environment or a scenario where we can sort of follow how we use this graph. And based on these 2, we prototype and build wireframes and prototypes and sort of produce queries. And then we end this session with the sort of that feedback loop where we should have done enough for whoever is sort of like the decision maker here to say yes or to say no or to sort of pivot the idea. But the key here is that we achieve this in 3.5 days as opposed to like 9 months, right, of looking at this internally. So I want to share just some pictures of what this experience looks like, sort of in reality. So for the generating of use cases bit, it's pretty much straightforward design thinking, and I'm sure a lot of you have been in those types of workshops. And the key here is that we are not there to be sort of provide expertise around the business use case, and that's where what the customer is doing. We're only there to sort of facilitate the path into understanding graphs. So these are some pictures from different workshops that we have done, and as you can see, it's pretty cross-functional team from the customer side. It's from the developer side, but also from the business side. So after we have arrived at a backlog of potential use cases, we go into modeling, and here we of course leverage the fact that graphs are extremely intuitive just as a model, right? Where the cool thing here is that regardless if you are not technical at all, this is something that you can actually follow, because it's just a representation of the business. And these sessions are facilitated by our field engineers. And pretty quickly, we actually move into the database and do quite advanced cipher and algorithms and so on. I'm always kind of amazed how deep we can go in just a few days, even technically. And the key here is that we don't simplify anything. We don't want to like dumb down any of the complexity. We really want to build models that take all the complexities into consideration. But there's also that aspect where we want to make sure that it's, when we traverse it, that it's the explainability of what the graphs actually does in different types of scenarios is obvious, right? So it's that mix between keeping it simple without simplifying. And then we have this sort of the tangible part, which is the last part of these 3.5 days, which is the building of the prototypes. And prototyping, it's kind of like an art form in itself. Like if you build a too polished prototype, people will start seeing flaws. They will comment on like typos and stuff like that, which is of course not where you want to end up. So you want it to be like rough enough for whoever you're showing it for will see potential and like get inspired, again, ideas. And here we also, again, start pretty broad. It's very like wireframey. The thresholds to participate is super low. And we try to get a sense of, okay, based on entering this new paradigm, what would be possible, like with a tool or a process and so on. But also here, we want to move in quite quickly to a refined state where the prototypes that we build are actually beautiful. Like they are sort of rendered in a way that is like, oh, this would be really cool if we had. And the team that we've been working with feel like proud to share it like within the company and so on. So this part is not at all to be underestimated. It's a very, very important part. And having it sort of correspond with the technical under the hood type of narrative, it's very, very powerful. And then we end up with these executive presentations. So these are a couple of examples from completely different domains, where what you see here is basically a hyperlooped keynote presentations, where we talk about what we have been doing and so on. And as you can see, they're very, very different, although they have all followed the exact same recipe. Like, we don't change the methodology at all. So this just sort of is a testament to that it's really on the customer side that the domain expertise happens. We just facilitate this. So the impact we've seen from these labs, from these 2 years or 18 months of labs, has been really, really extraordinary. So we've done 40 plus projects so far, and typically it's Fortune 500 companies, but we've also done some of these labs with startups as well. So we don't discriminate like that. It's just that it seems like the big enterprises are more of a need of these types of fast-moving projects than startups are. And what we've seen is that the real value here is definitely have decreased the time to validation. Like if graphs is something that you want to explore, you want to sort of short-circuit this. Like, you don't want to build a proof of concept for a year and then end up with like not putting it in production. Like, so if we can help you to fast forward that that's really valuable because it's super expensive to waste time when it comes to these sort of transformation projects. And the third part is that it really increases the use case accuracy, right? Like, so if it's only like a developer or architect that is looking and exploring graphs, they will almost guaranteed like miss some of the business aspects, and some of the they might even be connected to like the company roadmap and so on. So to have these three perspectives meet when you sort of forge these use cases, it just increases the accuracy and the hit rate of being successful. And we've been doing this in all kinds of industries, everything from like software companies to heavy industry, energy companies, healthcare company, media company, telcos, etc. And the use cases have been sort of like what you can expect. It's been kind of like all over the map, right? Like a recommendation engine, smart cities, personalization, churn prediction, customer journey, automation, yeah, all kinds of like graphy stuff, right? And again, the feedback has been really extraordinary in the sense that I think what most sort of participants give us feedback on is that it's first of all the speed. Sometimes it's projects that they've been looking at for years and not gotten together to look at this in a way that it's holistic, right? And now not only did they sort of come together as a cross-functional team looking at it, but we also have like a prototype and a technology that that may or may not be a good fit for that use case. But it's really the speed, I think, and also the amount the output that you can produce by intentionally going into one of these sort of bubbles for 3.5 days with a cross-functional team and us bringing our domain knowledge of the graph to produce something pretty extraordinary in a short time. Cool. Yeah, so if you're interested in learning more about this, you can email me or connect on LinkedIn, and I'll happy to get on a call or talk to you and share more in detail if this is something that, yeah, that makes sense. And that's it for me and for today. Thank you for coming.